Well, I grew up in Pittsburgh and lived there really up until college age. My father was an orthopedic surgeon. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, and so really had a relatively privileged upbringing. I had the opportunity to go to a private school in Pittsburgh, Shadyside Academy, and really had all the educational advantages that any kid might want. So it was a idyllic sort of childhood in many ways.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
Two sisters, one who's older and one who's younger. Classic middle child, and it was interesting because I was really the only one who had any particular academic sort of bent or oriented to school perhaps more than my sisters over the time, which is fascinating just to see the diversity in siblings is coming from the very same environment, but quite different from my sisters.
What were the conversations like around the dinner table?
Well, it was interesting because oftentimes the dinner table didn't include my father, who had quite long hours. He would be gone in the morning when we would get up, and he would typically come home after dinner, go off and dictate his charts, as was the system at the time, and would oftentimes be then off on weekends playing golf. So for me, the perspective on a physician's life was not particularly attractive, and it was a challenge for me to sort of think through at that point what I was interested in doing. I was always a kid who was interested in science. I had a little laboratory in my room, and I would do experiments, and I had a blowtorch, and I had would make my own gunpowder. So some of it was sort of typical boy stuff. You know, I'd have a chemistry lab, but what I would make is gunpowder, you know, blow up my my car models. But life as a physician was not looking particularly attractive at that point. So it really wasn't until college where I had continued interest in science and sort of figuring out what would I like to do with this background interest. And it was pretty clear from some laboratory work in college that the lab wasn't right for me. So medicine, and I had decided finally by that point that medicine was probably right, but I could choose a different path than what my dad chose. Mm-hmm. And my dad was a fellow who had his first heart attack when he was 38 and then passed away at, I believe, 62 from cardiac disease. So he paid the price for the lifestyle that he led. So
did you knew what he did as a physician? Did you go to work with him, or did you have any interpersonal experience with his practice?
A little bit. I did spend a couple opportunities in the operating room with him, watching him operate, and so that was a fascinating opportunity for me. And I'm very much into photography, and so at that point I was doing some photography of his work, and for many years he had my pictures of his hands in the operating field with a patient up on his wall. But I had a sense of what it was he did, and also had a sense of the stature he had in the community by virtue of what he did. He was chief of orthopedics at his institution, and it really was interesting to sort of see the social role that the physician had by virtue of being in the position that he was in. So I did have a pretty good idea of what that life was like, but also again had the idea, at least as time went on, that there were choices you could make as a professional about exactly how you wanted to live your professional life, and it didn't necessarily have to be as work-oriented as his life was. I think from early on I had a sense of the notion of integrity and honesty, and for whatever reason, and I don't think I had any adverse experiences that sort of pointed me in that direction, but I had always had sort of a internal demand to be sort of honest and forthright. It sounds a little odd perhaps, but I think I was sensitive to the notion of honesty and the role that I played in life, and maybe to some extent some of it was a sensitivity to having been given so much. So I think probably that was what was maybe some seeds of later concern about issues in bioethics, and particularly the kinds of issues that I'm interested in with research ethics and the notion of honesty and transparency. Folks that I came to respect the most were, turns out to be the folks I think who were the hardest on me in many ways, who had the highest expectations, because it takes a little bit of time to recognize that in fact those are the folks who are doing you the biggest favor by how they deal with you. So it was coaches on the golf team, a coach on the golf team, and math teacher, and a few folks like that who were had high expectations, and that was, I think, probably influential for me in terms of realizing that was the best way to at least deal within the kind of education environment to get ahead. Well, I had decided once I left college and was going to medical school that pediatrics was likely to be my future course, and mostly because I just like kids and working with kids. Once I got into medical school and you have the opportunity to rotate through a variety of different clinical opportunities, then I was less sure, because there were so many different opportunities that now became available. It's pretty clear I wasn't interested in being a surgeon, mostly from personality types probably and lifestyle issues. So pediatrics, once I did the clinical rotation, then there just was no question that that's clearly what I wanted to do. And I was interested from an intellectual standpoint in genetics. And that went back to my college years. And for whatever reason, I just found genetics to be a fascinating field. So it might have been a logical choice as I got into medicine to choose genetics as a course of study. But I think I found at the time, and a certain element of this that remains now, is that the challenge with genetics is still so much a matter of sort of figuring out what's wrong, what's the syndrome, what's the nature of but not having much of a toolbox in terms of being able to help those kids. True for neurology, true for less and less so as time goes on, but still a significant element. And so I think it was the lack of good therapeutic opportunities in genetics that led me away from a decision to focus on genetics as a professional. So it was interesting once I got interested in ethics, then to sort of return to the genetics angle, which has always been my interest in ethics. And so it's been fulfilling in that regard to be able to return to that field that was interesting to me from early on, but yet not something that I wanted to do as a clinical practice. Did my residency at the University of Colorado in Denver, Children's Hospital, University Hospital, and the fellow who was there when I first came was Tom Starzl, and he's subsequently gone on to great fame, well-deserved, as a transplant surgeon. He had really innovated, was an innovator with liver transplants for kids. But when I first came to Colorado, he was doing liver transplants on kids, but they didn't have the anti-rejection drugs at that point. Cyclosporin had not been developed, and so these kids were dying. And I don't know, he may have had a few successes, but for the most part, he would consult the pediatric service when these kids were in terminal stages of their disease and say, help me manage this kid at that point. So he was not popular among the pediatric service. So it seemed to me that this was a man who was sort of pushing beyond the boundaries of what we knew at the time. But yet, as soon as cyclosporin came on board, all of a sudden, everything he had learned in terms of the surgical techniques and the other ways to support the kids really came to fruition. And now, liver transplant's a godsend for kids and adults, and it works. It works remarkably well. And had it not been for Starzl and sort of the ability to push that envelope at a time where at least a lot of us were feeling he was pushing too far, we would not have had that service, at least as quickly. So, it's sort of challenging to think back. What if there had been rigorous IRB oversight? What if there had been ethicists who had been active participants in those protocols? Might they have said, you shouldn't be doing this. Let's shut down this until we find some better way to support these kids. Would we then have been ready for cyclosporin? Would the field have been prepared for the leaps that it then took ahead? It sort of gets back to this old joke about whether if ethicists had been around, would they have banned campfires because the risk of fire is, greater than the benefits, or some such analysis. So anyway, I think thinking back on it, that was probably a interesting experience at the time. I'm not sure it colored in particular my idea for research, and probably where I became more sensitive to the research domain was once I was in residency and clinical practice. And you begin to realize over time, if you're a skeptic, how little of what we do is guided by solid information. And these things that are taken as industry standards, as soon as somebody does a research project, find, well, it doesn't work. It's like, well, didn't somebody study that before? Isn't that why it's an industry standard? So, well, no. You know, it's as folks call it, it's not evidence-based medicine. It's eminence-based medicine, right? It's the people in the field who have dictated what ought to happen based on their opinions. So I became much more much stronger advocate for research once I began to realize how little it was that we knew and how soft the foundation was for much of what we took as standard care. Well, I'd spent some time on the Navajo reservation when I was in medical school. Pittsburgh had a strong connection with the Navajo reservation, and just had a wonderful, fascinating time. And then when I was a resident, I'd spent 6 weeks over in Thailand with the Laotian refugee camp. Also a wonderful experience. And so I was interested in international health, and so I went into private practice after my residency training was in Boulder. Really an ideal private practice circumstance, but I was getting frustrated as a few years rolled by because it was a upper middle class community, educated, you know, and they appreciated my services. Did a good job with taking care of the kids, but I wasn't seeing 50 more years of that type of day-to-day practice, and so I decided I would go back and try to develop an international residency program. So I went back to Hopkins for a master's in public health and was in the international health department. A variety of other factors sort of combined at the same time to lead me in a different direction, but that's what I was interested in with public health, was actually international health. And it's nice for me at this point because the public health angle has brought me back to some issues that I've been working on in recent years. It have to do with newborn screening and prenatal screening and sort of population-based interventions. But it's actually quite a different angle at the beginning.
And then what led to your interest in ethics, bioethics?
Well, I'd had no training in bioethics in medical school or residency. This was late 70s, early 80s. Sort of the first generation of ethicists were beginning to do their work at that point, and so I was completely unaware of it. It was really the baby doe issue that was 82, I think, 83. And I was chief of pediatrics in our little community group of pediatricians in Boulder. And the baby doe issue hit the fan, and they put up the signs in the nursery that said, if you're seeing instances of discrimination against handicapped newborns, call this federal hotline. So, well, it's kind of an odd way to deal with very complicated issues. So I said, maybe I should learn something about this bioethics. So I picked up Beecham and Childress's Foundations of Bioethics, and it was just a transformative experience in having read that book. And it was, people are thinking about these issues, people are writing about these issues. I never knew this domain was out there. And so at that point, we started an ethics committee in Boulder. And then when I went to Hopkins to do the master's in public health, I figured, maybe I'll continue my education while I'm here, have the opportunity to study some bioethics, learn a little bit more about the field. So I asked around, they said, well, Ruth Faden, I think, does some work in that field. So I'll take a class from Ruth Faden. And again, sort of transformative experience. And the experience with that program that they were just beginning at Hopkins, which was the affiliation with the Kennedy Institute and the Fellowship in Law, Ethics, and Health, subsequently became the Greenwall Fellowship. But I was first person to do their new program that Ruth had just developed in collaboration with the Kennedy Institute. And at that point, it became clear to me that I'd found the right field for me, and that this was really where I wanted to spend the rest of my career.
Well, you say transformative. How? What can you identify what clicked or was enlightened in you?
Well, the whole notion of sort of not struggling at a more I don't know, sort of gut level about what the right thing to do is, to bring that forward as an intellectual enterprise, to sort of think through issues in a way that you can come to at least a course of action. Whether it's the best course, you've tried to make that determination, but at least a course of action based on a set of principles and a set of rationales that you can discuss and present to others as a way to move forward. So sort of just bringing those emotionally charged issues to a more intellectual, rational level, to me was just so critical, because there was so much of medical care that I had seen as far more focused on the technical aspects and on the pathophysiological aspects, and not really attending to some of the value considerations. And I would never have been able to say that at the time, but I think it was a sort of underlying tension in my approach to medicine, that there wasn't adequate attention to thinking through these issues. And so when it became apparent to me that there were ways of thinking through, and the people who were doing this sort of work, and that this was opening up as a new professional opportunity to actually focus in this domain, then that for me was clearly the direction that I wanted to move. I think these issues ought to be integrated with education through the course of higher education in general, really starting from high school. And I don't know the best way to do that, certainly, but to not dichotomize things into what has been the tradition to a certain extent, which is sort of the hard sciences and then soft sciences. And you still see a reflection of that in how a lot of professional conferences are organized. You know, you have 2.5, 3 days worth of scientific presentations, and then they'll put the ethics presentation on the last day, last session, while everybody's, you know, grabbing their coats for the airport. So, you know, that the dichotomy there, I think, continues to be a challenge. So to try to introduce with students, and we try to do this to a certain extent with our medical students, is help them understand that it's all part of the spectrum of how people make decisions. You know, there's facts and there's values, and that thinking through how those are combined into appropriate decision making, I think, is appropriate from the beginning. Unfortunately, I think we're seeing now that the students are getting it. I mean, they are getting it now, much more so than 10 years ago. Students would roll their eyes at that point when we had a required fourth-year ethics course for the medical students, and we had a student who said, you know, I'm going into ophthalmology. Why do I need to know anything about ethics? It's like, okay, so here's we got to take a few steps back and start with that fairly fundamental challenge. But now I think the students are understanding that this is an integral part of medicine, an integral part of so many aspects of our lives, that talking about it from early days is the right way to approach it.
Why do they understand that now? Is it because it's in the media? Is it offered formally earlier in their education?
We are at our institution now. We're doing it that way, and I think a lot of institutions are. And I don't have particular expertise in the medical ethics education field, but I think that's been the trend, is to try to integrate that more thoroughly within. And it may have to do something, too, with who it is that's getting into medical school, because I think the selection process has also been a little bit more sensitive to not picking just the kids who've done well in calculus and biology, but have a more diverse background that can think through some of these social aspects to medical problems.
How would you characterize the difference between general ethics and ethics directed towards pediatrics?
Well, I think most of the issues tend to be the same. The complexity always is the full spectrum that you have for kids across the span from being a entirely dependent newborn to being a fully functioning 17-year-old who may well have decision-making capacities that are the same as superior to the rest of us. So trying to deal with that extra layer of decision-making authority and understanding, and the occasional conflict with parents and how to negotiate the authority figures and understanding across that gap. So I think it just adds that third huge element in decision making. The other element, I think, is the probably severalfold. One is the hope that we bring to kids, and that their lives are ones, if we have a significant impact, they've got a life to live before them. The ethical issues with adults oftentimes have some of that same element, but oftentimes, most kids don't die. Every adult dies, right? So at some point, all of us are going to reach that point, and there would be hopes for a nice ending, but there's not hopes for much of a future beyond that. Whereas with kids, you always have that hope that if you're lucky, if you can just do that right thing, that they'll have a full life ahead of them. The other complexity, too, relates to how we consider as a society the moral value of kids. And here I'm thinking more in terms of the newborn, and maybe even if we want to take that prenatally, of course, the huge social debates about what's the moral status of a fetus and an embryo. And so I think that there's some interesting issues still around how do we consider the life of a brand new baby, a 24-week preemie, and do we afford the same value to that child that we do to a 10-year-old, because we've gotten to know the 10-year-old and we don't yet have had the opportunity to get to know this preemie. So I think there's some complicated issues there too. Part of our work in recent years has been to try to do more education around some of the issues that are that they should know more about in order to make important decisions for their lives. But it's such an enormous barrier to try to have even the time to talk. That there's education barriers in terms of the background knowledge people have about the subjects, but there's such a crunch just in terms of the time window you have. So it makes such a importance out of how do you streamline that conversation so folks have a little bit better understanding of what the nature of those choices are. So I think in circumstances where you have kids who have chronic illnesses or at least extended illnesses, that you do have the luxury of a little bit more time to sort of begin to work through those issues. And of course, that's when parents are so much more effective as advocates for their kids, because they learn stuff pretty fast. They're reading the chart and they figure it out. And at that point, it's a very different relationship than the parents have with providers, a much more equal relationship that I think is important to look at as a model. But can you take lessons from that relationship and sort of extend it back when you've only got a brief interaction? It's difficult. And so I think fortunately with most of the complicated ethical issues we deal with, I think we tend to have a little bit more luxury of time to help folks become more powerful decision makers, more informed decision makers about the issues. My understanding of what the literature tends to show makes me an advocate for treating the older kids, the adolescents, much more like we treat adults. So I think an assent form for a 16-year-old ought to look very much like a consent form for an adult, which doesn't mean, the 20-page graduate level document that we often hand to parents, right? It ought to be simple, straightforward, easier to understand, and that the older kids ought to be engaged in that same respectful way that adults are. Younger kids, I think that span between sort of 7 and 9 and 14 or so are I think, a very difficult age range to engage in a meaningful way, because so many of those kids are still dependent on parental decision making. And so probably it's less an issue of the permission piece and a little bit more emphasis on the informed piece. We want to make sure you know what's going to happen as part of your participation in this protocol. We want you to agree to participate with us, but we mostly want you to understand. The younger kids then, I think, have been almost completely ignored by the system. So the parents say yes, it's okay to peel the 5-year-old off the ceiling or the 3-year-old off the ceiling, probably more likely for that, fourth blood draw. And so I think experienced pediatric institutions, I think, are pretty good about engaging those younger kids in ways that's less frightening and less burdensome to them. But I think we need to think through the notion of dissent a little bit more. It's sort of part of the original writings when the regs were being crafted, but didn't make it into the regulations. So I think we ought to take seriously what's, if a 4-year-old is truly dissenting, they're letting you know in clear terms that they're not on board with this intervention, then to me, we have to think of ways as ethical investigators to respect that dissent, even though at this point the regulations don't require that. So I have oversight for a variety of the regulatory offices at the university. So I report to the vice president, but my whole domain is the IRB, conflict of interest, biosafety to a certain extent, research misconduct. Those offices report to me. So fortunately, I'm in a wonderful position of having hired excellent people to do a lot of the day-to-day work there. So most of my oversight for those has to do with beyond the budget issues on an annual basis and deciding about some of those administrative things, as being a resource person for the more challenging cases when they come up. So from my perspective, that's an ideal circumstance to be in. Not necessarily the best hands-on manager for these sorts of things on a day-to-day basis, but pretty good at problem solving around the interesting, more challenging cases. And, my staff want my sign off on stuff that if they think is going to be controversial, it's helped to have my buy-in. So a lot of the activity is at that level. A fair amount of activity, too, at just the policy development level. So very active in developing our COI policies, very active in developing policies at the institution now about biobanking and institutional conflict of interest. So there I work with folks across campus. It's a campus-wide position, so it's School of Medicine, but also the rest of the university. So we get involved with very interesting conversations around some of those policy issues. So that's half my job. The associate VP thing is half my job. The other half I have to find my own resources. So I'm not taking care of patients anymore. So I am active with grants and NIH grants in particular to pursue a variety of different topics. The IRB is an obstacle, and it's designed that way. And fortunately, at our institution, I think this is probably true at most institutions, the number of protocols that are actually disapproved on an annual basis is a handful at most. Quite a few that may be tabled for additional dialogue and potential changes, but the vast majority of protocols get through. And so I think the community investigators, from my perspective, has largely incorporated a lot of the basic ethical notions that we now take for granted that are part of the regulations. Balancing risk benefits, the notion of peer review itself, ceiling on risk for children is appropriate in certain circumstances. The whole notion of informed consent, that wasn't inherent in the practice of medicine a number of decades ago, but people don't question that any longer. So I think that folks, for the most part, have believe in the notion of the regulations and have bought into a certain extent with peer review, at least for the majority of studies. And so I think the main challenges have to do with excessive oversight from IRBs, and some IRBs probably in particular. And so there, I think, is where the real challenge continues to lie. And of course, I put my own studies through the IRB, and we've had some serious challenges in recent years with what I thought were inappropriate IRB decisions that significantly impaired a very large budget project. And so I too have had some of those same experiences with frustrations with IRBs. But I think for the most part, I'm a big believer in the current system. It certainly can be improved, but I think one of the biggest problems with the system really is bad IRBs as opposed to bad regulations or bad concepts that are driving the regulations.
So how would you characterize a bad IRB, and what can be done to improve that?
Well, I think there's a couple different ways you can be bad. One way is simply excessively approaching issues through just a checkbox format and not really an opportunity to think through what the ethical challenges are. And so sometimes with my experience at the IRB in the past, you would see protocols that seemed to be flying through, and then somebody would ask a basic question like, well, so what is the justification for this placebo group in this trial? And all of a sudden, well, that's a pretty big issue. Or has anybody talked about how these test results are going to be returned to the research participants? Oh, okay, that's all of a sudden a pretty big issue, where that might have flown through the IRB without adequate attention to those issues. So I think IRBs that sort of don't attend to those basic issues and things fly through, that's sort of one sort of being bad. Another way of being bad is simply hyper, what's the right term here, sort of overly aggressive administrative and oversight action, sort of no trust in the investigator community to come to reasonable determinations about issues. And you can get into bureaucratic back and forth around protocols. And at this point, I think our IRB turnaround time for most new protocols is between about 6 weeks and maybe 8 weeks. That, I think, is not a flash, but it's a pretty reasonable period of time. IRBs that are, for whatever reason, spending 6 to 9 months on routine protocols really are a problem. And I think that setting better standards or having higher expectations for the efficiency of the system, I think, is important.
Is this a problem that you can just throw resources at, or do you think there needs to be a more intelligently designed training or framework for IRBs to work with?
Good question. I don't know the answer to that. I think in some circumstances it's probably resources. And IRBs in the past certainly were significantly underfunded. I think that's been less of a problem in more recent years, just anecdotally. But I think that it probably has to do with attitudes of the people who are running the IRBs and what they see their job as. And I had a critique in the literature a number of years ago that I responded to that was sort of called the petty tyranny of IRBs. And I think whenever you get circumstances in which people are given power, some people like to use that power to they just like to use the power because it's intrinsically satisfying for some reason. And so I think there are circumstances, I imagine, in which that's more of the issue, people using their authority for reasons that aren't really promoting the goals that we all agree are worth promoting, but become harassment of the research community to a certain extent.
Well, let's talk about the second part of your life then, the grants and the research that you yourself are interested in doing.
Right.
Tell me about that. What are your focuses?
Well, my longstanding focus has been ethical, legal, social issues, and genetics. And so we have had a variety of projects over the years. One of the earliest, I think it was the first R01 I had back in the 90s, was a opportunity at that point. The BRCA1 gene had just been identified. There was a large kindred in Utah, as they sometimes are, that was 800 people. 800 people who were ostensibly at risk for carrying a BRCA1 mutation, men and women. And so we offered them the opportunity to learn their results. So part of the question was how many people are interested in learning the results, and the second part of the question was, for those who were tested, how do they respond to that information? And so it was fascinating work, and sort of very much got me into the more empirical side of research. The social and behavioral research really is what it is in a biomedical context. In more recent years, we've been dealing with issues around newborn screening, and particularly the issue of the retention of residual blood spots by state programs. So here's a wonderful marriage of public health, genetics, bioethics, health policy, sort of all the things that I've been interested in for a number of years. So we've done quite a bit of work in that domain. And part of it is understanding how do people think about this issue. Now the project we're working on is how do we provide them information that they think is important to know. So we've gauged what do people want to know is the question. And then when we provide them the information that they've told us they want to know, How do they respond to that? So newborn screening is our state-based programs, so that brings in the government aspect of them. And they've been going on since the early 60s. In fact, this year is the 50th anniversary. So it's the PKU test. But now that's expanded to more than 30 conditions on state panels across the country. The perception has been for many years that the tests are so important for kids that parental permission is not necessary. So now only Wyoming and the District of Columbia have a parental permission process. So what that means is the information is not required to be given to parents about these programs. So there is a brochure. All states have brochures, but the brochure sort of goes in the bottom of the bag when you've had a new baby. And most folks who've just had a baby aren't looking at the bottom of the bag to the brochures. So folks are poorly informed about this phenomenon. So what's become controversial in recent years is that many states will save the leftover blood spots. After the tests are done, they'll save the leftover blood spots, as is done across much of clinical medicine in general. The residual tissues are saved. And those may be available in certain circumstances for research. So parents in Minnesota and Texas became aware of this situation, brought suit, and for the most part they lost those lawsuits because parents said, subsequently research we've done, and we talked to folks in detail about it, the basic answer is we support research, we get it, we think it's a good idea, but we want a choice. So how do you then build a choice into a phenomenon that is conducted at the population level? Where you have states, Utah's a relatively small state, but we have some 53,000 kids born a year. States like California, New York, of course, may well have 1,000 kids born a day. So how do you develop a system that has meaningful conversation with people about this complicated choice? And is it okay to proceed with this on do you need an opt-in system? Do you need people's signatures? Is an opt-out system okay? So these are some of the issues that we're trying to deal with now. So it's sort of the biobanking issue in a particular context. It's also sort of the Rebecca Skloot, the Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks issue in a little different context. People are thinking about that book and that particular case without actually recognizing that that's going on all the time now in a variety of different contexts. So how to inform people, the nature of the choice that we as a society want to give to parents around these issues, and how to manage those spots in a way that will promote public health while honoring people's informed choices about that is really a pretty serious fundamental problem. And my point of view has been that the actual risks associated with it are pretty close to zero. Nobody's had an instance in which there's been any harm to people that have come from this type of activity. But when you talk to people, they say, that's a piece of me or my baby, and I wouldn't have thought the state was saving a piece of my baby. What's that all about? And how could you do that without asking my permission? So you sort of have to balance what are two very legitimate, important, but competing considerations. I think much of what we're trying to do now and what unifies the projects they're working on and unifies my work with committees like SACHRP goes back to this notion of transparency. And that as a profession, as investigators, as clinicians, as public health, I think transparency has to be the goal that we are promoting, but yet is so challenging. So easy to say, so difficult to do in many circumstances, but something that we can bring new tools and considerations to. So try to think of innovative ways to convey information to people. So we're thinking about developing a game interaction that would be a sophisticated visual presentation of choices that people might make. I'm thinking specifically about the prenatal context, for example. So folks have gotten used to games, and the beauty about games is you can choose to be whoever you want to be. You might want to be somebody just like yourself. You might want to be somebody who's different and make choices that you might not be attracted to, and like to sort of see what those implications are. We're in very early stages of thinking about this. our group at the University of Utah. Utah actually has a premier gaming entity as part of our engineering school. So we're thinking about this as a way of helping people walk through decisions that would be important for them. So particularly in the prenatal context, clinicians do a lousy job with conveying very complicated choices. You get a brochure, you're pregnant, think about this test. If you have some questions, let me know. Different states, different practices, different clinicians, of course, do a much better or a much worse job for that. But it hasn't changed much in 50 years. We've got a lot of new tools out there, and people are used to learning in different ways. So if we can bring some of those tools forward to help people explore these ideas on their own, not make it purely contingent on what the obstetrician is able to say in that first clinic visit, then I think we have more opportunities for informed choice. Well, I've been with SACHRP almost consistently since its inception, in one way or another. I started with one of the subcommittees, Subpart D subcommittee, back in 2003, I think it was, when that first got started. And so I've been on a couple of different subcommittees. I was on the main committee itself, I think, from 2006 to 2009, and now I've been the chair for almost a year. So,
what do you think that is unique to you and your background and your interests are you bringing to the committee?
Well, I think a couple things. Certainly just the experience of being out in the research community, research administration for a while, sort of thinking about and writing about some of these issues. And I think that that's helpful. A lot of people have that sort of background and interest, though. So I think the reason that I have had the opportunity now to be chair is probably more to do with how I have some abilities with sort of practical problem solving and helping to consolidate conversations and thinking and sort of move the group to the next stage. So I think it's probably more an issue with just how do you run meetings. So, how much of that is I had decided when I was 10 that that's what I wanted to do with my life, was be good at running meetings, right? So, but as it turns out, it is a useful skill set to have, and so I think that I think I'm reasonably effective with helping people with conversations in that sort of context and kind of identify issues. Maybe that's a somewhat separate skill, but I think I have some ability to recognize issues that are ripe and important for addressing and sort of moving forward to the next stage.
Well, how would you characterize the biggest challenge ahead for SACHRP?
I think the biggest challenge is just probably that, which is identifying issues that are ripe for comment and that will have an impact on the system. And as whenever you work with the federal government, you recognize how enormous it is and how many different moving pieces there are, and how there's a great deal that goes on behind the curtain that you as a non-federal person don't have the opportunity to see. And so you have to have some awareness of, as best you can, of how the larger system works, and then find issues that you can make an impact on that will be welcomed by the regulatory authorities, OHRP, welcomed by other folks at HHS, and really be functional within the research community more broadly. And there's a number of things SACHRP has come forward with that simply have not seen the light of day. And so those, for whatever reason, were issues that either weren't welcome particularly at some entity within HHS, or their perception was that there was wrong advice perhaps for the research community. So I think the real challenge there is how to find the best way to have an impact. Because it's entirely possible to do a great deal of work and have none of that see the light of day and sort of sit on a website and gather dust.
What do you think the average person on the street needs to understand about research?
I think picking up on the question, I would say what we know is that their understanding of how the system works in general is virtually non-existent. And so we did a whole series of focus groups around Utah and then extended that to several other states to address questions around access to medical records and access to residual tissues. So part of the question was to tell them, that people access their records and people access these tissues without their knowledge. Well, first of all, that's a huge surprise to people. It's like, whoa, really? I would have thought you just threw that stuff away, the tissues. And I thought, people think about their records on a chart someplace stuck on a shelf. So the lack of basic knowledge about how the broader system works is absent in terms of the research that's going on. I think what folks don't also understand is that there are oversight mechanisms. The whole notion of an IRB is, in my experience, virtually unknown to the population. So I think the conception probably is investigators think up these things, decide to conduct an experiment, and if you're lucky, he or she has a good heart and a good brain and is going to conduct that in an ethical fashion. So the notion that there's a pretty robust oversight system and that folks have to justify what they're doing is unknown to people. And we found in our focus groups that that's a significant relief. Folks begin to get it. And that alone provides a great deal of reassurance. So I would say there's then at least a couple of things that I would like the public to know. One is not so complimentary of the profession, which is that we know a lot less than you think we know, and that there's a lot of questions that need to be better evaluated in order to bring you better care as a patient. So we need to be doing more research, and that there's really a significant moral imperative to do more and better research. So that's sort of the basic ethics issue behind all of it. And that there are, as mentioned, mechanisms to help oversee that so that it's conducted in an ethical fashion. My focus, or what my focus I hope will be with SACHRP, really is informed consent, and it goes along with this notion of transparency. I think we've learned enough since the regulations were originally written that we can do a better job with how we're approaching that now. And so helping people to truly understand the nature of the choices being offered them in the particular research protocols is really quite critical. And we may well find, it's entirely possible, based on concepts around the therapeutic misperception, that if we get rid of that misperception, less people will participate in research, or at least say yes at the beginning. Now, more of them may stay in the research, and the loss of research participants during the course of the research is a huge problem. So it's not clear to me, where that trade-off is at this point, but from an ethical perspective, I think we have to accept the downside of better informed participants, and that truly engaging people as partners in this enterprise will have benefits that outweigh the burdens in terms of the quality of information that we obtain.
We've seen the explosion of information, computer, internet. There are vast amounts of knowledge available to anyone at an instant's notice. How do you think that affects the progress of research and the validity of the studies that are being done?
Well, I think it offers some real opportunities, and I'm fascinated by this new development about the learning healthcare institution that really offers us opportunity to think about how we're going to acquire these data sets that aren't acquired necessarily in the conduct of research, but through normal clinical care, and what are the appropriate boundaries to our access to that information to answer these sorts of questions. So it relates very much to the sort of work that we've been doing with newborn screening and the public health. And once you get to these large numbers, some of the properties change about the ethical issues, because it's much more difficult to engage in a meaningful way on an individual basis. So I think that I see that as a good development. The access to that information I see as almost entirely good from a research perspective. Now, what's problematic, though, is that I think that there's a perception of risk on the part of the population and the part of a lot of research community that has not been borne out in actual experience. I think the actual risks associated with database research, associated with biobank research, is pretty close to zero. Why is that? Is it because you can't identify people? No. People have the skills to cross-link databases and figure out who people are if they've got the right skills. I think the reason is that nobody has incentive to do that. Why would researchers want to re-identify people, and how would they conceivably use that information in ways that would be nefarious? I mean, useful to them, enrich them. There's just no significant abuse potential from an investigator's standpoint to access this information in ways that is harmful to people. So I think we lose sight of that basic motivational factor, and there's this huge debate that I've participated somewhat in this notion of, is DNA sequence intrinsically identifiable? And should we therefore consider all genetic research to be non-de-identifiable? And I think it's not a meaningful question, because yes, you probably could figure it out if you had the right other resources to cross-link it with, but who would want to do that? The only people who have done it to date are people who are informaticists who want to show that they can do it, right? As opposed to bad guys out there who have evil motives in mind. Can that information be abused? Probably, but not really from the research community who have other interests in looking at those data sets. So I think we're going to have to think about those sorts of risk issues as indeed the amount of information continues to expand that are available about all of us in a variety of different venues in our lives. And the abusable stuff probably is sitting much more at Amazon and Facebook than it is in the investigators' data set.
Is there something that you are particularly proud of, that you or a work group of yours or a department that you've been involved in, some product or some outcome that you can say, wow, we did a good job there, I did a good job there?
Yeah. I think our IRB at the University of Utah is probably what I'd point to, and that really has to do much more with the leadership with the IRB. That I had some, I'll take credit for choosing folks who were leading that effort, but we were early adopters of an electronic system and developed that, I think, in creative ways, and have developed what I think is a efficient IRB that's responsive to our investigators. And we had a new vice president for academic affairs, which is the main campus, not the biomedical campus, brand new vice president who came in a couple months ago. And she had been here actually for a few months when I first met with her, and she said, so where are the complaints from the social and behavioral sciences? She said, my last institution, they were lining up to complain about the IRB. She said, I've been here for a couple months and I haven't had a single complaint. So I think we've been successful in managing the integration of social and behavioral with biomedical. We have a responsive IRB that if folks have complaints or questions, it's an open door policy, and efficient processes that sort of get things through in a way that's reasonable for investigators' timelines. So I'd probably say that's what I'd point to.
Can you identify personality traits or skill sets that you have that have stood you good stead?
I think probably its ability to do just practical decision making, practical collaborative decision making. I don't make enemies, and I've been able to do well with my career without stepping on anybody else to get ahead, and I think that comes back to you over time in good ways. So I think that being able to help think through some of these issues, and I don't have, I've got a pretty limited philosophy background and sort of formal bioethics training background, etc., but so much of that really is practical problem solving, and so I think it's probably that ability to engage in practical problem solving and come up with collaborative solutions that has served me well.